On January 16, 1942, a private plane carrying Carole Lombard slammed into a mountain outside Las Vegas, killing everyone on board. She was 33 years old. She was the highest-paid actress in America. She was returning home a day early on a plane she had insisted on taking against her mother's warnings because she wanted to surprise her husband. And her husband, Clark Gable, was in Los Angeles that same night, at a dinner where his co-star from his current picture, Lana Turner, was also present. Lombard had been hearing the rumors for weeks. She had rushed home to check on him. 3 days after the crash, Gable stood at the El Rancho Hotel in Las Vegas, sorting through caskets. 3 of them. His wife, her mother, and his own publicity agent who had been on the plane because Lombard didn't trust flying alone. Gable would spend the rest of his life sleeping in the bedroom they had shared, wearing her robes, and refusing to change a single thing in their ranch house in Encino. When he died 18 years later, he was buried in the crypt he had built for her. He was also, by then, on his 5th wife. Clark Gable was called the King of Hollywood, and the title was earned. He won an Oscar. He was Rhett Butler. He was the biggest male star of Hollywood's golden age for nearly 3 straight decades. And he married 5 women, none of whom got the version of him that Carole Lombard had, because Carole Lombard was the only one he ever really loved, and Carole Lombard died at 33 in a field of burning aircraft wreckage. 2 of his wives were nearly 2 decades older than him and paid for his career. One was his equal, his match, and his ghost. One he married in grief and divorced in bitterness. And the last one was pregnant with his only son when he had the heart attack that killed him, and she gave birth to that son 4 months after burying his father. There was also a daughter he never publicly claimed, born to another actress in secret while he was married to wife number 2, hidden in a convent, and passed off as adopted for 31 years. This is the story of the 5 women Clark Gable married, the 2 he actually loved, the one whose death he never got over, the child he wouldn't name, and the tragedy that ran underneath the biggest movie star in the world from the day his mother died, at 10 months old, until the day he was lowered into the ground beside Carole. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Every wife Clark Gable ever had was, in some way, a substitute for a woman he could not remember. Her name was Adeline Hershelman Gable. She was Roman Catholic, of German descent, married to a Protestant oil well driller named William Henry Gable. And when she gave birth to her only child on February 1st, 1901, in a little town called Cadiz, Ohio, the doctor wrote "female" on the birth certificate by mistake. That was the first documentation error in a life that would eventually be surrounded by more myth than fact. She wanted to name the boy Clark. Her husband refused. He said the name was too soft, too effeminate for a son of his, and he registered the child as William, after himself. She lost that argument. Then, 10 months later, in the fall of 1901, she died. The illness was never precisely recorded. Some accounts call it a brain tumor. Others say epilepsy. It happened fast enough that Clark, as an adult, would say he had no memory of her at all. Not a single image, only the fact of her absence. His father, on the same day he filed her death certificate, walked back into the courthouse and changed the boy's name. He added Clark as the middle name. It was his one act of grief, and he never spoke about it again. The child who would grow up to be the biggest movie star in the world had his mother's chosen name for him only because she died before she could lose the fight. William Gable Sr. did not want to raise a baby alone. He sent the boy to live with an aunt and uncle in Pennsylvania and left him there for close to 2 years. When he finally came back for the boy, he did it the way he did most things, without ceremony. Clark came home to a man he barely knew, in a house without a mother, in an Ohio town where the wind blew coal dust off the freight trains and the men worked with their hands. In 1903, when Clark was 2, his father married a woman named Jenny Dunlap, and this is the part of the story that matters, because it is the only warmth Clark Gable ever got from a parent. Jenny was a piano teacher. She was gentle. She saw the shy, oversized, jug-eared boy who had been passed around like a suitcase, and she decided, immediately, that he was hers. She taught him piano. She gave him books. She dressed him carefully and encouraged his interest in words and music, and she called him tender, and she meant it. His father hated all of it. William Sr. looked at his son learning piano scales from a woman and saw the same softness he'd tried to erase from the birth certificate. He mocked the boy for it, called him a sissy, and pushed him toward what he considered proper masculine work: hunting, farming, the oil fields, anything that would make a man of him. Clark absorbed both messages, the tenderness and the shame, and he carried the split between them for the rest of his life. He would spend his adult years hunting and drinking and playing the manliest man in America on movie screens, and going home to older women who tucked him in and looked after him. In 1917, when Clark was 16, his father lost money and moved the family from Cadiz to a farm in Ravenna, Ohio, closer to Akron. Clark hated the farm. He wanted to be in a city. He dropped out of high school in his junior year, moved to Akron on his own, and got a job in the Miller rubber factory alongside thousands of other Ohio boys grinding out an existence. He was 17 years old, tall, awkward, ears that stuck out, and going nowhere. Then he wandered into a theater one night in Akron and watched a play called The Bird of Paradise, and everything changed. He didn't say it changed. He wouldn't have known how. But something in him, watching men and women pretend to be other people under the lights, cracked open. He started volunteering at the theater, sweeping floors, moving scenery, doing anything they'd let him do to be near the actors. He was too shy to try out. He just wanted to be in the building. That plan lasted until 1919, when he was 18. Jenny, the stepmother who had loved him, got sick. Clark rushed home. She died before he could really say goodbye. And his father, waiting for the funeral to end, told him it was time to stop the theater nonsense and come to Oklahoma. There was oil money to be made, and William Sr. needed a partner. Clark did not want to go. He went anyway, because his father said so, and because Jenny was in the ground, and there was no one left to argue on his side. Oklahoma nearly killed him. He worked on the rigs for months, hating every hour of it. The physical labor was brutal. The smell of crude oil got into his clothes and his skin, and his father rode him constantly for being too slow, too soft, too much like the boy Adeline had wanted, and not enough like the man William thought he'd raised. Clark grew silent. He waited. He was waiting for money. When he turned 21, in February of 1922, he inherited $300 from his grandfather. In today's money, roughly $6,000. It was the first time in his life he had any resources that were his alone. He took the money, told his father he was leaving, and walked out of the oil fields for good. He drifted for the next 2 years, traveling stock companies, tiny theaters, odd jobs to eat. He piled logs in Portland, Oregon. He sold neckties at the Meyer and Frank department store. He auditioned everywhere he could, and mostly got told no. His ears were too big. His voice was too high. His clothes were wrong. He looked, one director said, like a farmer who had wandered off a truck. But in one of those theaters in Portland, he crossed paths with a woman who saw something the others hadn't. She was 40 years old, a drama coach, small and sharp and utterly certain of her own opinions, and she looked at this 23-year-old Ohio farm boy with the awful ears and the terrible teeth and said, out loud, that she could turn him into a movie star. Her name was Josephine Dillon. She was 17 years older than him, which put her almost exactly the age Adeline would have been if she had lived. And she was about to become the first of the 5 women Clark Gable would marry, and the first one who would pay, in every possible sense of the word, for what he was going to become. Her name was Josephine Dillon, and by the time she met Clark Gable in Portland, Oregon in 1922, she had already lived the life he was still dreaming about. She was 40 years old, born in Denver into a well-off family, the daughter of a judge, sister to an opera singer, educated at Stanford. She had been an actress in New York, then a stage director, and by the time she arrived in Portland, she had opened her own acting school called the Little Theatre, teaching drama to the daughters of wealthy Oregon families. She was small, precise, formidably intelligent, and, by every account, very much in charge of any room she entered. Clark Gable was 21, drifting through Portland after fleeing Oklahoma, piling logs and doing whatever else would keep him alive. He heard about the Little Theatre, walked in, and asked to be taught. Dylan looked at him and saw, underneath the ears and the terrible teeth and the loud Ohio farm boy voice, something the other agents in Portland had not seen. She saw a leading man, and she decided, at 40, unmarried, to build one from scratch. What followed was the most complete makeover in the history of Hollywood's prehistory. She started with his body. He was 6'1", gangly, chronically undernourished from the years of drifting, and he moved like a man who had spent his adolescence in oil fields. She put him on a program to fill him out. She fixed his posture. She taught him how to stand, how to enter a room, how to hold his hands. Then she went after his voice. His natural pitch was too high, almost boyish, and it undermined everything else about him. Dylan spent hours a day, month after month, drilling him lower. She made him breathe from the diaphragm. She trained him to project. Slowly, painfully, the voice you would eventually hear in Gone with the Wind was pulled out of a shy Ohio kid by a 40-year-old drama coach, one syllable at a time. She also paid for his teeth. His originals were crooked and stained yellow from years of neglect, and no camera was ever going to love them. Dylan covered the dental work herself. She paid for his hair to be properly cut and styled. She bought him better clothes. She was, in every practical sense, funding the man Clark Gable was going to become, out of her own bank account, while he lived in her house and studied with her every day. At some point during those Portland years, the relationship crossed from teacher-student into something else. Not a romance exactly. Josephine Dillon was not a romantic woman, but a partnership, tight and possessive on her end, dependent and grateful on his. In 1924, they moved together to Los Angeles so Clark could try Hollywood, and on December 13, 1924, they were married at a small ceremony in Los Angeles. He was 23, she was 40. On the marriage certificate, she listed her age as 34, shaving 6 years off in a small vanity she must have known would come out eventually. It came out later. The marriage, Josephine herself would admit decades later, was never consummated. She said this openly to a Los Angeles Times reporter in 1955. They had married because they needed to travel together, share hotel rooms, work in close quarters, and 1924 America did not permit an unmarried man and woman to do those things. The wedding was, on some level, a legal convenience for a professional arrangement, but it was also, on her side, real. She loved him in the way a maker loves the thing she has made. She would love him in that way for the rest of her life. For 4 years in Hollywood, nothing happened. Clark got extra work, bit parts, nothing that stuck. Josephine kept coaching him, kept pushing, kept believing, and Clark, quietly, started to look around. Because in Los Angeles in the late 1920s, a good-looking 26-year-old man was noticed by a certain class of older, richer, more socially connected women, and one of them, a Texas oil widow named Ria Langham, had noticed him. Ria could do things for Clark that Josephine no longer could. She had real money, not drama coach money. She had connections in New York, where he was going for a stage role. She could dress him properly, introduce him to the right people, and put him in front of the studio executives who mattered. She was also, not incidentally, 17 years older than Clark, which was the exact same gap as Josephine. He was already, without quite understanding it, replacing one older mother figure with a better-funded one. In 1929, Clark asked Josephine for a divorce. She was, by her own later account, not surprised. She said he had brought it up before, and she hadn't taken it seriously. This time, he was serious. Ria was insisting on marriage, and Clark wanted a quick, quiet Mexican divorce so he could move on fast. Josephine refused. She had been used, and she knew it, and she was not going to make it easy. She filed for divorce in California and cited desertion as the ground. California law required a full year of separation before the divorce could be finalized. She chose that path, knowing exactly what it would do. It would frustrate Clark, it would frustrate Ria, and it would force him to wait. The divorce papers went through in March of 1929. The final judgment was entered on April 1st, 1930. The timing turned out to be almost cinematically cruel to Josephine, because just weeks after that April 1st ruling, Clark Gable signed his contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Within 4 years, he would win an Academy Award for It Happened One Night. He would be, before the end of the decade, the biggest male star in Hollywood. Josephine watched it all from a small house in the San Fernando Valley, teaching drama to whatever students she could get. In August of 1931, she wrote a bitter letter to Louis B. Mayer at MGM, calling Clark an ungrateful chiseler who had used her to become a star and then thrown her away, leaving her in financial ruin. She threatened to sell her story to the newspapers unless MGM helped her. MGM sent some money. The story never ran. She kept teaching, kept scraping by, kept, on some private level, still loving him. In 1955, when Clark was married to his fourth wife, and still one of the most famous men in the world, the confidential scandal magazine ran a piece titled "The Wife Clark Gable Forgot," painting Josephine as a discarded old woman in a shabby house in Van Nuys. A Los Angeles Times reporter went out to talk to her. She would not attack Clark. She said only that she had loved him, that she had done what she thought was right, and that she wished him well. She was 71 years old. She would live another 16 years and die in 1971 of pneumonia, alone, in a nursing home in Glendale. She had been the first wife. She had been the maker. She had given him his teeth, his voice, his name, and his career. And when he no longer needed her, he had left her the way he would leave every wife except one, cleanly, quietly, without ever quite explaining himself. The pattern was set. Josephine was just the first to learn it. And Ria Langham, waiting in New York with her money and her connections and her much better parties, was already, in 1930, teaching him the next set of lessons. She was also, unknown to her, about to preside over the biggest secret scandal of Clark Gable's life, a pregnancy hidden in a convent, a child no one would name for 31 years, and the young actress at the center of it was already in the trade papers as one of Hollywood's rising stars. Ria Langham was a Texas widow with 3 husbands behind her and a lot of oil money, and she had been watching Clark Gable for 2 years before he was free to marry her. Her full name was Maria Franklin Prentice Lucas Langham, and she was a very particular kind of American woman, born in Kentucky, raised into Houston high society, married and widowed and married again since her teens. By 1928, she was living in New York with her 2 grown children from earlier marriages, and she had money of the kind that Josephine Dillon could not have imagined. She was also, at 43, 17 years older than Clark, which was almost exactly the age gap Josephine had been. He was, again, without ever quite acknowledging it, choosing a mother. The story goes that Ria's teenage daughter Jana saw Clark on a stage in Houston with a traveling stock company and came home telling her mother about the beautiful actor she'd just watched. Ria filed the name away. When Clark showed up in New York in 1928 for a Broadway play called Mackinac, still married to Josephine, still poor, still climbing, Ria arranged to meet him. Whatever passed between them was fast. Clark had a wife in Los Angeles. Ria had a Manhattan apartment, money, and connections that could open every door he needed. She started spending it on him immediately. She paid for his clothes, better ones than he'd ever owned, tailored suits and evening wear. She fixed the last of what Josephine's dental work hadn't touched. She introduced him to Broadway producers and New York society. She dressed him up, took him out, and made it clear to every important room in New York that this Ohio farm boy was somebody worth knowing. Josephine was 3,000 miles away in Los Angeles, teaching drama to somebody else's students, and the money she'd spent on Clark's teeth and voice was becoming, quietly, an investment that another woman was cashing. When Clark finally forced the divorce through in 1930, Ria was ready. On June 19, 1931, just months after the California decree became final, they married in a Santa Ana courthouse. Clark was 30, Ria was 47. She listed her age as 44, borrowing Josephine's trick with the numbers. And here is where a certain pattern in Clark Gable's life becomes impossible to miss. Because he had done it again. He had married an older, wealthier woman who could teach him the next thing he needed to learn. Josephine had taught him how to act. Ria taught him how to be a gentleman. She schooled him in society manners, the fork order at dinner parties, the right way to speak to a producer's wife, the etiquette of the world he was climbing into. She dressed him for MGM. She was, in every real sense, his finishing school, and she loved being Mrs. Clark Gable. She gave interviews, she toured on trains with him, she posed for photographs with his mother and his stepfather. She fed the fan magazines wholesome stories about the perfect Gable home life. The Gable home life was not perfect. Clark had been signed to MGM in 1930 by producer Irving Thalberg, and within a year he went from an unknown bit player to a leading man. By 1934, he had won the Academy Award for Best Actor for It Happened One Night. He was, by the middle of the decade, one of the most famous men in the world. And he was, on almost every picture he made, sleeping with his co-stars. The list is not short. Joan Crawford, a full-blown affair that everyone in Hollywood knew about, and Ria absorbed in silence. Marion Davies, who was William Randolph Hearst's mistress and lived in a castle. Elizabeth Allen, Anita Page. There were more. Clark had discovered, or perhaps always known, that a movie star of his rank could have almost any woman he wanted, and he wanted a lot of them. Ria heard the whispers. She had married a much younger man, and she had, by her own calculation, made her peace with what that meant. She kept the wholesome interviews going. She hosted the dinners. She refused, publicly, to notice. Then came 1935, and Call of the Wild, and Loretta Young. Young was 22 years old, a Warner Brothers star of the first rank, devoutly Catholic, and one of the most beautiful faces in American movies. Clark was 34, married, and by then unable to make a picture without a co-star affair. The two of them shot Call of the Wild on location in the mountains of Washington state, cold, isolated, and completely away from Hollywood's eyes. What exactly happened between them there has been described by every version of every source in a slightly different way, and it matters because it produced a child. For most of her life, Loretta Young said only that she and Clark had a brief romance on the picture, and that she became pregnant. Decades later, in a conversation recorded shortly before her death in 2000 and confirmed by her daughter-in-law Linda Lewis in a 2015 book, Young revised the story. She said the encounter had not been consensual. She said Clark had come into her train compartment on the ride back from the Washington location and raped her. She said she had never used that word for what happened to her, because as a Catholic in the 1930s she had not had the language for it, but that was what it was. Clark, for his part, said nothing about any of it, ever, publicly, for the rest of his life. Young disappeared from Hollywood almost immediately after the shoot wrapped. The official story was that she was going on an extended European vacation. In reality, she was hiding a pregnancy from a studio that would have destroyed her career if it became public. She stayed away from the cameras for months, refusing all interviews, avoiding photographers, and eventually she came back to Los Angeles and gave birth in a rented house in Venice, California, in early November of 1935. It was a girl. She named her Judith. The scheme that followed was elaborate and, in the language of the era, effective. Young placed the newborn in a Catholic children's home. She waited 19 months. Then she adopted Judith from the orphanage, publicly, as an unmarried Hollywood star doing a charitable act. The press bought it. So did the public. So did Judith herself. The child looked exactly like Clark Gable. She had his ears. Not just large, but the same specific shape, protruding, unmistakable. As she grew, the resemblance became so obvious that Young eventually had her ears surgically pinned back as a child to muffle the whispers. Judy was raised in convent schools, sent away from her mother for long stretches, and told, when she asked about her father, that she had been adopted. She believed it until she was 31 years old. Clark, meanwhile, received the news the way he received most personal news, at a distance. He was in New York on business when a telegram arrived at his hotel from an unknown sender. It said, according to the account he later gave friends, "The baby was born, she is beautiful, and has blonde hair." He never confirmed who sent it. Loretta and her family later suspected her brother-in-law. Whoever it was, Clark understood the message. He responded to it by doing nothing. He did not go see the child. He did not send money. He did not, publicly or privately, acknowledge her as his. He returned to Los Angeles and to Ria, and he kept working, and for the rest of his life he behaved as though Judith Young did not exist. Only once, years later, did he apparently come by the house to see her, when she was a young girl. Loretta introduced him as a friend of the family. He sat with the child briefly and left. She would not learn until adulthood that the tall man who had visited that day and looked at her strangely had been her father. Ria did not know, at the time, that a child existed. She knew only that her husband had come home from Washington State, more distant than usual, and that the pattern of infidelity had continued, and that the sturdy magazine version of the Gable marriage was becoming impossible to maintain. She held on for a while longer. She was not a woman who gave up easily. She would have to give up soon, because Clark, in 1936, was about to be cast opposite a blonde comic actress named Carole Lombard in a light picture called No Man of Her Own. He had worked with her once before, briefly, in 1932. He had not been particularly impressed. This time, everything would be different. This time, the actor who had made his career on affairs he could walk away from was about to meet the one woman he never could. Ria Langham's marriage would end quietly, expensively, 3 years later. She would sign the divorce papers in Nevada in 1939. She kept the Gable name for the rest of her life. She would tell friends, decades later, that Clark had never been unkind to her, only unfaithful, only absent, only, in the end, in love with somebody else. And that somebody else was Carole Lombard. The first time Clark Gable met Carole Lombard, they made a picture together, and neither one of them thought much of the other. It was 1932. Paramount had cast them together in a light drama called No Man of Her Own. He was 31, a rising leading man, married to Ria, and already on his way to becoming the biggest star at MGM. She was 23, blonde, sharp-tongued, and already, by any Hollywood measure, a serious talent. She was married, too, to the actor William Powell, and it was already coming apart. They shot love scenes together for weeks. Lombard later told a friend, in the kind of dismissive line only she could deliver, that they had done all these hot love scenes and she had never gotten one tremble out of him. He didn't think about her much either. When the film wrapped, they exchanged joke gifts, as friends did. She gave him a ham with his own picture stuck on the front of it. He gave her a pair of ballet slippers. Then they went their separate ways for 4 years. The second meeting was different. Everything about it was different. It was January 25, 1936. Producer David O. Selznick had asked Lombard to host that year's White Mayfair Ball, one of the biggest social nights on the Hollywood calendar, a dress code affair where every man came in black tie and every woman came in white. Lombard threw herself into the planning. She was, by then, one of the highest-paid actresses in the country, divorced from Powell, 32 years old, and running her own life in a way that Hollywood women, mostly, were not permitted to do. Clark came to the ball that night with a date, still legally married to Ria, though effectively separated. Lombard was there without a partner. They ran into each other on the dance floor and started flirting, hard and fast. In that way, two people flirt when they have 4 years of professional distance to burn through in one night. Clark, at the end of it, invited her back to his hotel room. Lombard looked at him and asked, out loud, "Who do you think you are, Clark Gable?" He didn't take it well. He drove her home and left, offended. She went to bed thinking about him. The next morning she woke up feeling she had been too hard on him, and she did something that tells you everything about who Carole Lombard was. She called a pet shop. She had them deliver 2 live doves to Clark's hotel. She bribed one of the desk clerks to let the birds into his room while he was still asleep. When Clark woke up, there were 2 doves in his suite, and one of them had a note tied to its leg. It said, "How about it, Carole?" That was the beginning. For the next 3 years, they lived a secret double life. Ria was refusing to divorce Clark quickly. She had money, she had the Gable name, and she was not going to make it convenient. So Clark and Carole hid their romance in plain sight. They snuck around the studios. They took hunting trips together where nobody would recognize them. Photos exist of the 2 of them wearing overalls and fake mustaches, going to a county fair like a farm couple from nowhere. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood, in a costume store mustache, walking around a state fair with Carole Lombard on his arm, laughing. That is a real photograph. It exists. What was between them was different from anything Clark had had with a woman before. Josephine had been a coach. Ria had been a finishing school. His co-star affairs had been what they were, transactions between 2 people who were passing through. Carole was the first equal he had ever met. She matched him. She was as famous as he was. She earned as much as he did, or more. She swore harder than he did, drank harder than he did, and hunted better than he did. She was also, underneath the wisecracks, kinder than he was, and paying much closer attention. He called her Ma, she called him Pa. Nobody has ever quite explained why 2 people in their 30s chose those names for each other. Maybe because he'd never really had a mother, and she was, on some private level, the first woman who felt like home. Maybe because they were pretending, together, to be the ordinary couple neither of them ever got to be. It doesn't matter. It stuck. Ma and Pa. For the rest of her life. By 1938, Carole was pushing him hard to finalize the divorce. Ria kept refusing to sign. So Carole at one point actually broke into the Gable house where Ria still lived, sat down at the dining table, and told her, face to face, that she was going to marry Clark whether Ria signed anything or not. It didn't work. But it tells you what kind of woman Lombard was. She did not wait for permission. Ria finally gave in March of 1939. The divorce cost Clark most of his money. Ria got the house, half his assets, and the last laugh. On March 8, 1939, the papers were signed. 3 weeks later, on March 29th, Clark was given a 2-day break from the set of Gone with the Wind, where he was in the middle of playing Rhett Butler. He and Carole got in a car with 2 friends and his press agent Otto Winkler and drove all night to Kingman, Arizona, to a justice of the peace, and they got married at 4 a.m. in a courthouse with almost nobody there. Clark called MGM the next morning and told them Rhett Butler was now married. Then he drove back to Los Angeles and went back to work. They bought a ranch, 20 acres in Encino, in the San Fernando Valley, that had belonged to the director Raoul Walsh. It became known as the House of 2 Gables. Carole loved it immediately. She turned it into a working farm. There were chickens, cows, horses, cats, dogs. There was a stable Clark could tinker in, an orchard, a shooting range. The 2 of them installed adjoining master suites because their filming schedules kept different hours, and they decorated the whole rest of the house to please him. That was Carole's project, making Clark, the Ohio farm boy who had never really had a home, at home. The marriage looked, from the outside, like an American love story of the highest order. In the middle of the run-up to Gone with the Wind, and then during its release, at the exact peak of Clark Gable's fame, he was going home every night to a wife the whole country adored. The fan magazines could not print enough of them. Ma and Pa on the porch, Ma and Pa hunting quail, Ma and Pa's ridiculous joke gifts, which had continued from that first ham. The Encino Ranch was full of gag presents wrapped in ribbon, waiting for whichever holiday came next. Clark once gave her a beat-up old jalopy tied with a red bow. She once gave him a pair of ratty long underwear with a heart sewn on the seat. Underneath it, the marriage had its shadows. Carole desperately wanted a child. She went to specialists, including a trip to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and none of them could tell her why she wasn't getting pregnant. She never would. And Clark, whatever else had changed, had not entirely stopped being the man he had been through the Ria years. There were still rumors on every picture. Not as many, not as brazen, but they were there. Carole heard them and, being Carole, went straight to the sets to check for herself. She showed up unannounced. She stood in the shadows behind the cameras. She let the co-stars see her. Whether she succeeded in stopping him, or whether he had just gotten better at hiding it, is the question that hangs over the last 2 years of the marriage. Because by the fall of 1941, Clark was making a picture called Somewhere I'll Find You, with a young blonde named Lana Turner. And by late 1941, the rumors from that particular set were starting to reach Carole's ears. So Carole's. She would decide, before the end of the year, that she wanted to be closer to her husband, that maybe if she was more visible, more available, more present, the whispers would stop. She was also, because she was Carole Lombard, thinking about her country. The United States entered World War II in December of 1941. In the first weeks of January 1942, the U.S. Treasury Department asked her, as one of America's most beloved stars, to headline a war bond tour. They wanted her to go home to Indiana and sell defense bonds. The target was $500,000. She agreed immediately. She was 33 years old. She was the highest-paid actress in America. She had been married to Clark Gable for 2 years and 10 months. She got on a train on January 12, 1942, and left Los Angeles with her mother and Otto Winkler, the same press agent who had driven her and Clark to Kingman for their wedding 3 years earlier. She would raise $2 million in Indiana in a single day. She would beat her fundraising target 4 times over, and she would try, in the small hours of January 16th, to get home to her husband 1 day early, on a plane her mother had begged her not to take. She never made it. The coin flip is not a legend. It happened. It is in the coroner's inquest. On January 15, 1942, in Indianapolis, Carole was arguing with her mother and Clark's press agent Otto Winkler about how to get home. She had raised over $2 million in a single day for war bonds. She wanted the plane. Her mother wanted the train. So they flipped a coin. Carole called it in the air. She won. TWA Flight 3 left Indianapolis on January 16th, a Douglas DC-3 carrying 22 people. It stopped in St. Louis, Albuquerque, and Las Vegas. The last leg took off at 7:07 p.m. Because the country had just entered World War II, the mountain warning beacons had been blacked out on federal orders in case Japanese bombers used them for navigation. 13 minutes after takeoff, Flight 3 hit the west face of Potosi Mountain at nearly 200 miles per hour. The elevation of impact was 7,770 feet. The fireball was visible from Las Vegas. Nobody survived. Locals had a nickname for that mountain. They called it Double or Nothing. Clark got the news in Encino and was in a car to Las Vegas within hours. He arrived at the El Rancho Vegas Hotel before dawn on January 17th and refused to stop trying to reach the crash site himself. There is a photograph of him from that morning, unshaven, hollow-eyed, being restrained from riding a horse up the mountain. He got as far as the base and had to turn back. He waited at a saloon called the Pioneer in Goodsprings for hours, smoking cigars at the bar. The burn marks he left in the wood are still there today. Her body was crushed and burned so badly that identification could only be made through dental records flown in from Los Angeles, and by wisps of blonde hair that had survived the fire. On January 19th, Clark walked out of his bungalow to choose 3 caskets: Carole, her mother, Otto Winkler, his own best friend, who had died on that plane in place of him. He buried her at Forest Lawn on January 21st, in white, in a small ceremony as she had requested. The marker read, Carole Lombard Gable. She was 33. Clark bought the crypt next to hers for himself. The man who came back from Las Vegas was not the man who had driven up. He slept in Carole's bed on the ranch, wore her robe, and refused to let anyone move a single object in her rooms for the rest of his life. In August of 1942, at 41, Clark walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the Army Air Forces. He requested combat duty. He flew 5 bombing missions as a tail gunner over Nazi Germany. His crew members said, for the rest of their lives, that he did not seem to care whether he came home. Clark came home from the war in the fall of 1943, alive, decorated, and no less broken than when he had left. He came back to the ranch in Encino, where Carole's clothes still hung in her closets, and her hairbrushes still sat on her vanity. Nothing had been moved. Nothing would be moved. He went back to work at MGM, because there was nothing else to do. His first post-war picture, Adventure in 1945, was sold with a tagline the studio thought was clever, Gable's back, and Garson's got him. Clark hated it. The picture was a flop with critics, and a hit at the box office anyway, because America wanted him back on screen. But the man on the screen was different now. Heavier, slower. His hair was going grey at the temples. He was drinking a fifth of hard liquor most nights, and the crash diets he did before each picture were destroying his body. He was, at 44, already showing the wear of a man 10 years older. He was also, in the plainest sense, lonely, and for 4 years he handled it the way he had handled his adult life before Carole, with a rotating series of affairs, none of them serious. Actresses, socialites, hostesses. He was Clark Gable. The women were available. None of them were her. Then, in 1949, at 48, he did something almost nobody expected. He married again. Her name was Lady Sylvia Ashley. She was a British aristocrat, twice widowed, once divorced, born Edith Louisa Hawkes to working-class parents in London before she married her way up. Her second husband had been the actor Douglas Fairbanks Sr., who had died in 1939. She was elegant, blonde, socially connected, and she moved in the international set that summered in Palm Beach and wintered in the south of France. She was also, at 45, close enough to Clark's age that the old pattern of marrying older women was, at last, formally broken. They met at a party. They courted briefly. On December 20th, 1949, they married quietly at Clark's ranch in Encino. It was a mistake almost from the first week. Sylvia moved into the ranch and immediately began redecorating. She replaced Clark's furniture. She reorganized his rooms. She invited her London society friends to stay for weeks at a time, filling the house with people Clark could not stand. She served English tea. She was, in every way, importing the world she had built her career on into the one place Clark had built for himself and Carole. The ranch that had been Ma and Pa's was becoming Lady Sylvia's country house. Clark, who was not a man who fought openly, went quiet. He drank more. He stayed out later. By 1951, he had moved out. The divorce was filed in May 1951 and finalized in April 1952. Sylvia walked away with a substantial settlement. Clark walked away with nothing except the ranch, which she had made unrecognizable, and the certainty that he had married a woman he did not love, in a house he could no longer stand. He was 51 years old, and alone, and running out of time. The last woman in Clark Gable's life had been in it for 12 years before he married her. Her name was Kay Williams. She was a fashion model and B-movie actress, blonde, twice divorced, with 2 young children from her marriage to sugar heir Adolph Spreckles. Clark had met her back in 1944, dated her briefly, and moved on. They kept crossing paths through the late 1940s. Kay was their age to Sylvia was ending. Kay was there. On July 11th, 1955, at 54, Clark married her at a small ceremony in Minden, Nevada. It was his 5th wedding. It would be his last. Kay was the closest he came, after Carole, to something that worked. She was warm, patient, and unimpressed by his fame. She let him be the Ohio farm boy at home. She brought her 2 children into his life, and he became a real stepfather to them, teaching the boy to ride and taking the girl to ballet. He was, for the first time since 1942, close to happy. In 1960, at 59, Kay told him she was pregnant. Clark had never had a legitimate acknowledged child. He was overjoyed. He was also, at that moment, filming what would be his last picture, The Misfits, opposite Marilyn Monroe and Montgomery Clift. The shoot was brutal. Nevada desert heat, 100-degree days, and Clark insisted on doing his own stunts, wrestling wild horses on a rope, in a scene that even the crew knew was too much for a man his age. The delays caused by Monroe's illnesses stretched a 2-month shoot into nearly 6 months. He finished the picture on November 4th, 1960. 2 days later, on November 6th, he had a massive heart attack at home. He was rushed to the hospital and seemed to be recovering. On November 16th, he had a second, fatal heart attack. He was 59 years old. He was buried at Forest Lawn in the crypt he had bought in January 1942, next to Carole. 4 months later, on March 20th, 1961, Kay gave birth to a son. She named him John Clark Gable. He never met his father. Look at the whole shape of it. A 10-month-old boy loses a mother he cannot remember and spends the next 59 years trying to replace her. He marries an older drama coach who makes him. He marries an older socialite who polishes him. He fathers a daughter he refuses to name. He finally meets his equal at a ball where she throws doves at him, and he loves her for 3 years and buries her at 33. He goes to war hoping to die. He marries an aristocrat he cannot stand. He marries a warm blonde who almost saves him. He dies 2 days after finishing a picture, 4 months before meeting the only son he ever wanted. Josephine died in a nursing home in 1971. Ria died in 1966. Sylvia died in 1977. Kay lived until 1983. Only Carole was waiting for him when he arrived. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.